Okay, this is the my first test here at the online lecture. It would help if I was on the correct slide to start out. We're going to be looking at absolutism and constitutionalism today in Europe, and so the key features here is that we're going to be examining the differences between absolutism and constitutionalism, as well as looking at the features of European absolutism. What are the goals, and how was absolutism able to be created? And we'll look at Spain early on as an early absolutist player. So when we look at the rise of absolutism in the 17th century, I think it's important that we examined what's going on in the 17th century that allows monarchs to consolidate their power. We'd already been examining the consolidation of power with the new monarchies of the Renaissance. Now we're going to see it take a step farther. We're going to break away from that old medieval model where there were significant checks on monarchical power. You had the nobility and, of course, the church. And so what happens in the 17th century is a consolidation of power in some places in Europe. Some monarchs are going to be able to get absolute power. And essentially, there's no checks on their political power. So between, as you can see in the slide, between 1589 and 1715, two basic patterns of government emerged in Europe, in Western Europe: absolutist monarchy and the constitutional state. For the most part, we're going to see the rise of absolutist monarchy occur throughout Western Europe and Eastern Europe, with Great Britain and the Dutch Republic being exceptions with the development of the constitutional state. So there's some crises that predate the rise of absolutism in the 17th century. One of the things you read about in your book was the rise of the Little Ice Age. It reflects kind of the crisis that was faced in the late Middle Ages when there was the Great Famine. What we see is a cooling cycle hits a northern hemisphere, has a great effect on European agriculture. So this little ice age changed the climate, so there was problems with food as well. So we see a great deal more famines. We'll see more unrest among the peasantry. Climate changes always kind of tend to have effects on economics and politics. We're also going to see a lot of religious disunity as we've examined wars of religion, both the Dutch Revolt. We saw the civil wars in France, and the 30 Years' War. Those are going to be provide a significant background for the rise of absolute monarchs. And finally, we're going to see how conflict on the continent allowed some monarchs to consolidate their power, to remove those checks in the 16th century. I'm sorry, rather the 17th century. So as McKay says, this period witnessed a spectacular growth in army size, as well as new forms of taxation, government bureaucracies, and increased state sovereignty. That's going to be key, especially the growth of army and bureaucracies. In order to be an absolute monarch, you must be able to exercise your power throughout the country. And you have to be able to remove the checks on your power. And so having a bureaucracy to carry out your rule rather than depending on the landed nobility, and having large standing armies rather than depending on the nobles raising armies, certainly takes power away from them. It gives power to the monarchies. And so we're talking about those economic and demographic crises of the 17th century. As we get into the 1600s, most Europeans still are living in the countryside, although we've seen a dramatic rise in cities and towns throughout the Renaissance. The majority of the population is still agricultural and they're still rural. Bread remains the primary food in both diets, despite the fact that in the Renaissance we saw a rise in the consumption of protein and meat. But most people are still getting from grain. So bread was the primary food in the diets of both the rich and the poor, although the rich are more likely to have a variety of foods in there. So bread is incredibly important. So whenever you have disruption in grain, keeping in mind this is going to be have major effects on revolutions, especially the French Revolution. But whenever you have disruptions in grain, you have significant political repercussions for that. And so this rural society is always living on the edge of starvation because they're almost at subsistence living. And so when that little ice age hits, that's going to put a lot of people on that edge and put them under a lot of stress. So we're going to see disease, malnutrition as a product. Only the Netherlands experienced a golden age in the 17th century as far as economics and agriculture. Every other country tends to struggle a little bit in the 1600s. We're going to see Spain fall off the map. As a major economic player, major European player, because they're going to lose all their gold and silver coming from the Americas. We're going to see other countries struggle, but through trade, mostly the Dutch are able to have significant economic success, and they're going to have access to lots of food sources from the east as well. And they made some changes in agriculture, which allowed them to produce more food, which we'll talk a little bit more when we get to the Industrial Revolution. So the big theme of this is we see bread riots be more common in the development of this concept of a moral economy, where economy should have just prices for grain and just prices for bread. And we talked about, and this is still a time period in which the only political participation for most rural peasants is riots, collective action. So what are some common obstacles and achievements when looking at absolutism and constitutionalism in the 17th century? Major similarities: despite their political differences, absolutists and constitutional monarchies shared common projects of protecting and expanding their frontiers, raising new taxes, and consolidating state control. They're all still part of the growth of the nation state. They are still going to have consolidated state control. The difference is what happens at that state level. Are there shared powers at the state level? Are there checks on people's political power, or is it all in the hands of one monarchy with no checks on his power? That's going to be the key differences. So when we look at the similarity and obstacles to central control that both are facing, information is a problem in the 16th century. There's no internet. Definitely there's no TV. There's no radio. There's no trains, mass transportation. Roads are few and far between and not well maintained. So it's very difficult to get information even within your nation state itself. Language is a problem throughout Europe. France has different dialects being spoken all over France, and that creates its own problems of communication. That's true of other European states as well. So if you're a central government, how do you communicate with people in their own language? Roads and infrastructure, not much. So governments are going to have to invest in that if they want to centralize their power. Privileged groups, i.e. the aristocracy, how are they going to fight for their ancient rights and resist centralized control? And finally, the church, which always sees itself separate from political power, despite the fact of the growth of a Gallican church, and we've seen the Anglican church. So in Catholic countries, we're going to see the church still try to separate itself from politics. Some other similarities are in achievements. We're going to see both constitutional governments and absolute monarchs have greater taxation. We're going to see a growth of their armed forces, large and more efficient bureaucracies. That's going to be a key, the growth of bureaucracy, the number of people serving the state as their job. That is their job to serve the state, and they are loyal to the state. An increased ability to compel obedience throughout their state, meaning they're able to exert their power. So let's take a look at the two that really McKay and the AP curriculum really highlights when looking at the growth of absolute monarchs and the growth of the constitutional state. In both cases, bureaucracy and military are important. So larger bureaucracies means you have more people whose profession is the serving of the state, the central state throughout their territory. So what large bureaucracies, though, require is more taxes. They generate more taxes because you got more people collecting taxes, but you got to turn around and pay those people that are working for your government. And so large bureaucratic governments cost more money. They allow you to raise more money, but they cost more money. So what you have is you have a growth of civil service, which answers only to the king in absolutist states. That's really important. We'll see that in France. This is why the robe nobility is created, to have people loyal to the king that conduct his will throughout the state, and that's their only job, and they owe their position, their prestige, and their title to the king. The increase in the size of military also allows for greater central control. In the Middle Ages, you had to turn to the nobles to raise an army, which gives them a significant check on your power. What absolutist monarchs are going to do is they're going to have large standing armies. And to extent, even constitutional states, like in England, are going to start having standing armies. These are professional armies that are raised. Their job 24/7 is to be in the military, and they are paid by the centralized state. So that is who wields them. And so if you want to have an order on your state, the key here is how do you enforce that order? Well, you enforce that order with your standing army. Hold on, let me go to the next slide. All right. So sovereignty is something that's really important here when looking at the rise of centralized state. As McKay says, a state may be termed sovereign when it possesses a monopoly over the instrument of justice and the use of force within clearly defined boundaries. Max Weber, the famous sociologist, basically said, you know what a government is when you can put it to the measure of the question of, does it have a monopoly on violence? If it has a monopoly on violence within its territory, that's the sovereignty. That's where the government is. Now, sovereignty really means it's independent. But when we look at the sovereign of a state, who's in control of that state? The person in control is the person that is the wielder of force and the one that can wield that force and get away with it. And so we're going to see that sovereignty be more and more placed in the hands of single monarchs in the rise of absolutism. So while the 17th century states did not acquire total autonomy, they made important strides towards that goal. Warfare in the growth of army size. What is the driving force behind state building is the growth of that military, and the growth of that military comes with increased conflict in Europe. So as we go through the 17th century, as we said, we're going to see the growth of professional standing armies in Europe. And France is going to lead the way. Louis XIV is a great example of an absolutist ruler. He created a massive land army while Britain focused on the size of its navy. And it had to, because when you look at the population size, those are their advantages. France has about 4 times the population of England, and so it's the most populous state in Western Europe, and so it has a huge, massive populace in which to build a land army with. So it's tailoring to its advantage. The British, in the enforcement of their warfare, realized that their navy, I mean, their geography itself is an island country, so their protection is in their navy, and that can go all the way back to Elizabeth I and the Armada. And so the buildup of the navy for them is going to be significant. So in those two states, one that becomes a constitutional state and another that becomes an absolutist, are both at the same time increasing the size of the military in preparation for warfare on the European continent. And both are going to engage in warfare on the European continent. So one of the things that people argue a lot is that absolutism creates more warfare, and there might be some truth to that, but we also see constitutional states wanting to expand their power just the same and engaging in that conflict, and certainly that's true of English. So the quote from McKay here says, many historians believe that the new loyalty, professionalism, and the size of the French army is the best case for the success of absolutism under Louis XIV. And I think that's correct. We're going to spend most of our time looking at absolutism by looking at Louis XIV. Louis XIV is going to be the greatest of all absolute monarchs. And he's a perfect case study on how absolute monarchs actually got the way they were, and it's not just a model for historians. Monarchs his own of Europe that adopt absolutism, the Habsburgs in Austria. We're going to look at the Hohenzollerns in Prussia. You look at the Romanovs in Russia. They're going to all kind of model themselves for what was created by Louis XIV in France. Popular political action, and we go back to these bread riots. The turning of bread riots into popular revolts was extremely common leading into the 16th century. Popular revolts were especially common in France. As your book pointed out, some very famous bread riots that broke out there. And oftentimes those bread riots were targeted at governments. The people felt that it was the role of the government to reinforce a just price for bread, because that is the basis and foundation of civilization in Western Europe, because everyone's eating bread. Without bread, people die. And so oftentimes when they weren't able to afford bread and state tax collectors came in to those areas, you would see people turn on those royal officials and those royal tax collectors. So we are going to stop this section of the video here, and we'll pick up on the next recording, in the next section of the rise of absolutism and constitutionalism.